some help from Tara and others to help us moderate the Q&A as we go. Okay, so who are we? Before we dive into our topic, we thought we'd give you a little high-level overview about Sheridan College Institute of Technology and Advanced Learning. We have 3 campuses, Oakville, Brampton, and our newest campus in Mississauga, just outside of Toronto. So we're a commuter institution, just outside in the GTA. We're an undergraduate-only institution offering a full range of credentials, from apprenticeships and skilled trades programs to diplomas, 4-year honors, bachelor's degrees, and postgraduate certificates. We teach programs in the visual, creative, and performing arts, technology, business, applied health, and community studies. And so we focus on hands-on applied learning with small class sizes, with our research also tending to be applied and industry-driven rather than fundamental or curiosity-driven. So while we're 50 years young, we've had some pretty amazing accomplishments. We've been dubbed the Harvard of animation and have a number of alumni who've worked on Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, How to Train Your Dragon, Captain Underpants, and Big Hero 6. And we've recently been named by the Hollywood Reporter as one of the top 10 advanced special effects programs in the world. So earlier this year, we also had the Apple CEO, Tim Cook, and his visit to Canada, and we were the only post-secondary institution that he visited. And one of the ones that we're really proud of is through our Canadian Musical Theatre project, we incubated Come From Away. So that's where Come From Away got its start here at Sheridan College. So of course, those accomplishments are Sheridan on a good day, but what we're here to talk to you about today is a really significant challenge that we faced in the fall of last year, involving a total shutdown of our core operations with the cancellation of classes for 23,000 students that was due to a strike by our faculty, our librarians, and our counselors. And just to set some context, it was the longest strike in our history. And it's also one that we were powerless to prevent in some ways. What you might not know is that Sheridan is one of 24 colleges in Ontario, and colleges share one piece of legislation. So that means our collective agreements for our faculty and support staff are also shared. So a vote by academics to strike affected us all simultaneously at an aggregate level. Either all colleges are on strike or none are on strike. And really the challenge with multi-college bargaining is that colleges are represented by a bargaining agent. So Sheridan did not have a seat at the bargaining table to help prevent the strike or to negotiate a speedy end to the strike. And yet we knew that our students and parents would be turning to us for answers because they pay their tuition to us directly. So rather than taking you through a chronological recounting of our crisis, which is really context dependent, we've decided to frame our talk around 10 lessons from managing a crisis, again, in the hopes that you can take away something from what worked well for us in the event that you have either the same or similar or a different crisis that's large scale to manage at your own institution one day. We thought we'd play just one clip to take us back to the start of the strike and help set the context.
Good evening, I'm Nitish Basono. We begin tonight with breaking news. After hours of negotiating behind these doors, contract talks between OPSU, the union that represents the Ontario College faculty, and their employers, the College Employer Council, have broken down. As a result, 12,000 college faculty will be hitting the picket lines instead of going to class as of 7 a.m. Monday morning. Now, this will impact 24 public colleges across Ontario and affect more than 500,000 part-time and full-time students. Now,
so given the bargaining context and the constraints we identified, we set 3 meta goals for our strike response. The first was to sustain students' learning to the best extent we could and alleviate their building anxiety that came from feeling trapped or feeling like pawns in a dispute and the fear that they had for losing their term. Second was knowing that all strikes eventually end and the people on the picket lines would be critical to delivering the remaining curriculum to our students. We made a purposeful decision to act in a way that would sustain our historically strong relationship with our academic colleagues. We deliberately avoided getting drawn into any ideological discussions and beliefs that underpinned bargaining issues. We also allowed striking faculty to retain access to their electronic ID cards, email, online learning management systems, even though their union prevented them from coming on campus physically or virtually. And so by focusing on 1 and 2, we hope to achieve 3, because we recognize that our reputation lives in the hearts and minds of our stakeholders and is based on people's experiences with us. So lesson 1 is that your values and principles will never fail you. We began our campaign planning by looking at established frameworks for both issues management and ethics. These frameworks provided us with a structure, or like a backbone, or rules to live by when building out our response plans, so that we could really be confident that we weren't going on gut instinct. There's many good ones exist that you're probably familiar with, and I've just highlighted a few here that we like. The slides also have embedded links, so you should be able to explore these at your leisure. The first one links to Jim Lukashevsky's work, who's a master communicator at IABC. And his work centers on 7 steps that need to happen in the right order to communicate in a crisis and retain people's trust. Things like communicating with candor, explaining the situation, demonstrating empathy, a commitment to 0 repeats, and restitution, or what you're going to do to make it better. And his work aligns with the PAGE principles, another framework that deeply resonates with me, which is all about telling the truth, proving it with action, listening to stakeholders, managing for tomorrow, showing character, and remaining good humor. So our next step was to establish guiding principles for decision making. And we did this to ensure fairness, consistency, and timeliness in our response. Our principles that you see up on the screen became our watermark, and we use these when discussing questions or conflicts that stemmed from the work stoppage, what were brought to our attention. As long as our decisions could stand up to this yardstick, we felt we could proceed. So we also made a commitment to use two-way real-time communication, and it helped us uncover people's gaps in knowledge and their points of frustration or misunderstanding, which we could then action for decision-making or address in our future communications. So lesson 2 is really something we can't stress enough. You won't always have a long lead time, but there's almost always something you can do at least in advance, at a bare minimum, even having holding statements for various hypothetical situations. Now is the time to find out if your institution has a crisis communications plan or an emergency response plan, and finding out who owns it. In the case of our strike, all of these steps that you see were ones that we took well in advance of the strike, beginning in May, which was 5 months before the strike happened in October. And because this was a labor relations issue, we had our HR team take the lead in organizing and running contingency planning meetings. So you might want to pause and think about how this might work at your institution. If you had to form a core issues management response team, who would you have at the table, and what would be each person's role? At Sheridan, what we did was to ask each division or unit, we have about 30 in all, so everyone from athletics to student affairs, IT, finance, library, all of our academic faculties, everyone had to prepare a report, a standard report, on how a strike would affect their operations. They had to identify that in the event of an academic strike, what activities would stop, what they'd scale back, or what would continue. And we took turns presenting to each other so that we could each get a true picture of the impact collectively. And then we identified the business risks that we wanted to mitigate against, like loss of revenue, loss of enrollment, the potential for union grievances, perhaps increased level of stress for our students, and of course, our potential for reputational damage. And all of this work then became the foundation upon which our communications response plan was built. And it also seeded much of the initial content for our strike information landing page, our website, which was really critical, that you'll hear more about as we go. This is also the stage where you want to set rules about authorship and approvals of your communications assets. So think about the approval process at your institution. Who creates the materials, who provides input, who approves, and who just needs to be advised. Does legal get to weigh in? Does the president need to see everything or just some things? Prior to the strike or to any crisis is the time to have these discussions and set those parameters. Our HR team also worked at this point in advance of the strike with the union and with local police forces to establish a picket line protocol, which was a negotiated agreement. And it outlined the rules of engagement, including the location of the picket line, how long cars could be stopped, whether or not pedestrians could be blocked, and so on. So as you can see on this slide, our communications plan had several important elements. First came the inputs. This was the knowledge we considered when formulating the plan. So this was really our situational analysis. What was going on in the political, economic, social, legal realms, as well as the attitudes of our local public, such as their propensity to tolerate job action. This intelligence can give you important context in order to build a plan that aligns with stakeholder opinion. Next, we determined the outputs that we would use to mitigate the risks that we had previously identified with our contingency planning, and we set rules for how we'd operate. So for example, we created 2 hotlines, a phone hotline and an email hotline. For our phone hotline, we went direct to voicemail and committed to a customer service standard of 1-call resolution. That meant we triaged the incoming calls, did all the background work and running around, and then called people back with the answers, rather than bouncing them around and forwarding them to different departments at a time when they were already frustrated. We set a 2-hour response time on social during our stated monitoring hours, and each night we signed off for the night, signed back on in the morning to help manage expectations for timely responses. And we created an anchor website that was our official source of all information. So all communication drove people back to that site, which we constantly updated. And then, of course, we had our outcomes, or what we hope to achieve as a result of effective communication and strike management. So next in our plan was, the step was to draft our key messages, which first, of course, requires an understanding of your audience. We divided our audience into groups who were our primary focus, those directly impacted, and our secondary stakeholders, those who might need very specific information. One example was Canada Post and Public Transit. Both have unionized employees and will not cross picket lines. They needed really specific communication regarding how we'd accommodate their services on campus. We also needed to share that solution with students and non-striking employees. And our messaging strategy changed in the lead up to the strike. At the start of the summer, the potential for a settlement was actually deemed to be very high. There's a sister union at Ontario Colleges for Support Staff Workers, and they negotiated a contract extension to their collective agreement that was really similar to the offer that was on the table for the academic employees. This was also in the middle of the summer when enrollment tends to drop for us, so a strike really wasn't on the public radar. So 2 months out, our strategy was really just to be reactive. But about 1 month before the strike, which was mid-September, the potential for labor disruption grew as the union began to send really strong signals publicly that it was on the path to a strike. So given that move, we switched gears to a more proactive communication approach internally. We began to communicate with deans, directors, managers, and other leaders on campus so they'd be ready if and when students came knocking on their doors for information. By law, the union has to give colleges 5 calendar days notice of the date that they intend to take their members out on strike. Once this notice was given, we switched gears again and made our website live, which we initially built as a dark site in the month before the strike. We opened our hotlines, we began informing secondary audiences about what might need to change. We did media interviews to share our key messages, and we also shared what would be open or closed and where people could go to find information. So our launch messages prior to the strike were really factual and focused on educating people about the nature of collective system-wide bargaining, really to help people understand that we did not have the ability to prevent the strike nor to end it. And we also focused on sustaining our relationship with our faculty members, as Nicole mentioned, and we did that by being respectful and publicly recognizing their right to take job action. We knew that they would be instrumental in helping us recover from the strike, and they'd be in classes speaking directly to our students after the strike. So we couldn't afford to cause unnecessary ill will. And finally, our messaging included our commitment to students and supporting their learning objectives. So our microsite really became the centerpiece of our tactics. It included some context on bargaining, our FAQs, what's open, what's closed, the hotline information, resources like the picket line protocol. We had the library create self-study guides to help students keep up on their learning while classes were canceled. At Sheridan, email is also our official means of communication with our students, but with students not being in class, we recognize that they might not be checking their email. So we created a PDF of every email that was sent, and we uploaded them to a section on the Anchor site so people could find the latest updates and see that we were living our commitment to sharing information and being transparent. Our creative team also designed templates that we could use to give our updates a visual identity of their own on our social channels. And that made it easy for our students to recognize strike-related information in the sea of messages in their newsfeed. So to meet our commitment of timely, honest, and accurate information, we wrote different versions of our FAQs based on the channels we'd be using to disseminate them. So what you see here is just an example of a message that was posted on Facebook and then adjusted for Twitter. So lesson 3 is to be at the table, but recognize you can't do it all. We can't stress enough how important it is to be at the decision-making table, to be the voice of your audience and to bring their interests, needs, and concerns to light before operational decisions are made. But being at the table doesn't mean you have to do it all yourself in terms of communication. In an event this large, one that completely shuts down your core operations, you need to co-opt help and turn to other champions and agents, turn other champions and agents into assisters. But you also need to hold the pen so that the communications are accurate and consistent. It's also critical that you suspend any non-strike related messaging to demonstrate concern and empathy for those most directly affected by a work stoppage. So this chart just depicts our various communications channels and the groups responsible for managing them. You'll note our 3 decision-making bodies at the center, and these groups met daily. They heard updates from all stakeholder areas. We gathered intelligence through our hotlines and social listening, as well as daily discussions between our picket line captains and our HR liaison, which was all brought to the decision table for consideration and action. Decisions were then shared back throughout these various channels, ensuring true two-way communication and a timely, accurate flow of information. Lesson 4 is to know that the waters are constantly shifting and that you have to react accordingly. Although this is an oversimplified model for dealing with grief, when we look back at our strike now, 1 year after the fact, the aggregate emotional response from our students closely mirrors the Kubler-Ross grief cycle and its stages. It helps to understand their reactions as well as how we conducted social listening and how we tried to support the students throughout our entire communication efforts. So here we've mapped out the timelines associated with each stage and our strategy to assist our community by providing them with a tailored response depending on the needs at each stage. At the start of our strike, there was actually quite a few sentiments of relief. It was 1 week before our fall break week. A lot of students were feeling overwhelmed at this point with assignments and midterms piling up. And because people didn't initially think the strike would last very long, the mood wasn't all grim. With week 2 being our reading week, many in residence went back home, and students didn't feel like there was a gap in their learning because they already weren't scheduled for classes. As we got towards the end of week 2, it became apparent that a settlement wasn't going to be reached imminently, and the mood shifted. Here's one example of anger, and there were hundreds more like it. Our students are adults and they're paying for an educational service. They're also afforded all the rights and protections of the Consumer Protection Act. Many felt trapped and helpless, like pawns in a labor dispute. So we began to see fears expressed about pre-booked travel for our 2-week Christmas holiday shutdown. People questioned what would happen if the holiday got shortened to make up for loss of class time. Who would pay for those rebookings of trips? These were some of the toughest, longest days of the strike. Part of the bargaining is noticing what is not going well and stepping in to correct it. This mood of anger and frustration in week 3, when students really expected to be back in class, were rapidly losing patience and were seriously worried about not being able to recover academically. It was a major turning point we noticed in our strike. On the bargaining side, the narrative was changing. Rather than talking about contract matters like salary, job security, and job duties, the union switched their strategy and began to turn the strike into a fight for ideological beliefs and social justice, battling against the nature of precarious work and the gig economy for part-time faculty. This strategy galvanized people in the union and as well amongst the public. It was readily apparent that there was not going to be a quick resolution to the strike. And at this point, we decided we needed to do something. This goes back to our communications framework and the ideas like restitution and taking action. Despite our constant efforts to keep people informed with weekly email updates under the signature of our president and all the hotlines, we decided we needed to talk to people face to face. So we hosted open forums for students, in person, evening town halls with leaders on stage and a live audience so people could have their questions answered and vent their frustrations. And we had one per campus all in the same week. We announced them on a Friday. And on a Saturday, we had a DM on Facebook asking if they could be closed captioned to be inclusive of our students with hearing disabilities. We found a company and had them in place at the first forum on Monday evening to caption the live stream in real time. We live streamed them to our strike info page, and we also enabled questions to be submitted in advance via a form collector on our microsite. Every question we received electronically received an answer via email following the forums in case they were not able to tune in. We also asked an associate dean from our media arts program, who's a former CBC professional, to serve as our moderator and lend additional credibility to signal that questions would not be censored. The star of our show absolutely was our provost, who had significant experience in student affairs and was highly skilled in de-escalation. We heard many personal stories of sacrifice, worry, upset, but overall the mood was respectful. We were highly empathetic and kept reassuring people that somehow we would find a way to deliver the learning outcomes that they were promised when they chose Sheridan. What we quickly realized, though, is that having HR on stage served as a lightning rod to attract questions about the ideological issues. We deflected them all by reiterating that the purpose of the forums was to focus on helping our students cope and reminding people that we were not going to discuss bargaining, which was out of our control. For subsequent forums, we actually removed HR from the panel. We mentioned earlier that we have a daycare on campus. Seeing parents stuck in the lineups to get on campus in the morning led to a negotiated deal with the union to provide fast pass cards that were displayed on their windshields, which signaled to picketers that they should be allowed, they should allow these cars to bypass the lineup and proceed to drop off. We also came up with escalation procedures. There were several folks who were not satisfied with our hotline or social replies, despite efforts to take conversations offline or to provide facts and evidence. So we had to create a handful of these situations, and quite often they were parents being the worst offenders who were scheduled in for either phone calls or in-person meetings with a member of our senior leadership, and these worked wonders. We also completely forgot that we had pre-scheduled tuition fee installment payments set up in our system until that was flagged. So using our principles about fairness, empathy, and reasonableness, our decision-making team set the rule to not collect any fee payments for the duration of the strike, as the optics were very poor, and to make students pay for a service that they weren't currently receiving. With an issue as complex and as long as this one, there were many distractions that could take us off message and off strategy. You have to learn to recognize what's important and what's noise. We saw attack ads on our president, sympathy rallies with students in social justice programs, joining our picket lines in solidarity with faculty. An up-and-coming law firm was trying to make a name for itself by launching a class action lawsuit on behalf of the students at all 24 colleges. And very sadly, on only day 2 of the strike, we experienced a traffic accident that harmed a pedestrian, with our picketing faculty members nearby coming to the rescue until an ambulance arrived. We were laser focused and chose to ignore the distractions so that we remained committed to our guiding principles. And here's why the picket line protocol was key. After the accident, a police investigation unfolded to determine whether or not the picket line served as a distraction for the driver, serving as the cause of the accident. Sheridan was not at fault, and recall that the protocol is drafted with the input of police well in advance. And our faculty members were actually commended for their immediate action to assist the victim. Had we not done this in concert with the police, we could have potentially been held liable for issues related to the accident. While some people responded with anger, others did so with depression or anxiety. Some people expressed stress, others fear, others expressed that all they could do was cry uncontrollably. None of this would have been caught had it not been for our vigilant efforts with social media monitoring. As a result of these posts, we created a new escalation procedure with our student advisement team. Throughout the strike, we noticed 24 posts that were alarming cries for help. Of them, 14 accepted our offer to be connected with a person to discuss their situation. It's one of the things about our response to the strike that makes us most proud. The last stage of the grief cycle is acceptance, and while true acceptance at a community-wide level probably didn't come until partway through the second term, or even the entire academic year was done, we did see signs of acceptance on social, with posts of gratitude like the one shown here. We had a lot of people jumping in to defend us and indeed thank us for our efforts to support them. Lesson 5 is figuring out how to cut through the noise. You've probably all heard the statistic that a message must be repeated 3 to 5 times before people notice or before it sinks in. And we all know how much more powerful images are than words. In addition to the designed elements we gave our messages, we also use these principles to get our ideas across. Every week when we sent an email update from the president, we posted a message on social asking people to check their email and providing a link to the PDF copy of the email we uploaded to our anchor site. We always use plain language, headers and emails to make information more scannable on mobile devices, and we pinned the most important messages to the top of our social channels. All of these messages were reinforced through our two-way communication.
So our next lesson really is about being real and authentic. Authenticity is important to us as an institution, as I'm sure it is to all of you. We did a number of things to be genuine and real, which was really key to maintaining people's trust in us. We definitely played to our strengths. As Nicole mentioned, our provost was highly skilled at de-escalating burgeoning issues, so it was absolutely no accident that we put her in front and at the center of the stage at those forums. Our president at the time was a highly respected, strategic, and brilliant educator and administrator, but felt less comfortable and natural showing endless compassion live in action in the face of a litany of complaints. So we used her instead in our written communication. All of the email updates were under her signature, which allowed her to still be a face of the issue without putting her in an awkward spot. In addition to being authentic, we were always truthful, and we admitted when we didn't have the answer. We also used different vehicles like Instagram videos to feature frontline staff who could speak empathetically to students to tell them what services and supports were available on campus. Here you can see how our messaging changed as we neared the midway point of the strike, and how our focus shifted away from the educational and factual and really more towards expressions of our humanity and empathy. So lesson 7 is a really important one. The cat typing that you should see typing on your screen right now is Nicole and I. We were so caught up in trying to respond to the students that we ourselves were getting burnt out. So you really need to come to terms with the fact that there are never enough hours in the day, and you'll never respond to everyone as quickly as you like, and you'll never certainly please everyone. If we had to manage an issue this big again, I'd definitely ask for resources to create additional bench strength and put people on rotating shifts, very much like emergency responders do, so we could all hand the reins over to someone else and allow ourselves to recharge in between shifts. We had to find different ways to manage, like empowering others to assist us with communications or taking turns monitoring after hours or on weekends, and really recognizing the need to laugh. Here are just a few of the funny posts and gifts that students shared in their comments back to our social posts. And even though they were slagging us, we shared them with each other and with our broader team because they were pretty funny and they kept us going. So the next lesson really is that it's not over when it's immediately over, that memories really are long. And when most people in the province were rejoicing because the strike was over, really for us, it was almost as if our work was beginning all over again, a bit of rinse and repeat. The end to the strike came very quickly. The provincial government stepped in at the end of week 5, and over the weekend, they had an emergency sitting of the legislature to force academics back to work. The vote passed on a Sunday. On Monday morning, faculty came back in for one day of prep work to remap their curricula, and on Tuesday, students were back in class. The end was this speedy because all colleges made it really clear to our government that if more than 5 weeks of classes were lost, then the term would not be recoverable. And with an election coming in the next 6 months, the provincial government really did not want to anger 500,000 young voters. So a whole new team was put in place, but this time for recovery instead of contingency planning. And new guiding principles and decision-making criteria were established, which really centered on ensuring students would achieve the learning outcomes associated with their courses. And of course, we had to write a whole new communications plan for this phase. So this slide shows you the principles we established for recovery. Most of them are self-explanatory. The 72-hour rule was a direct response to fears and worries we started to see on social and through our hotlines toward the end of the strike. Essentially, we promised students that no test would be scheduled and no assignments would be made due for 72 hours after returning to class to allow them time to become familiar with the material again and reestablish their study habits. Our recovery decisions were the rules that the recovery team established in adherence to those principles. So we had to reschedule all classes to make up for lost time. And to do that, we had to extend into evenings and add weekend classes that we hadn't had before. Our fall term normally ends in December, but we had to extend it into January. We protected the holiday break, but shortened it from 2 weeks to 1. And we had to work with co-op and internship placements to shift arrangements for students who'd normally start their on-the-job learning at the beginning of January, but now who need to delay that start until later in January to accommodate the classes that weren't wrapped up in time from the last term. And a large percentage of staff time was also spent administering a provincially mandated $500 bursary that was given to any student who didn't withdraw as a result of the strike. And again, this really covers the concept of restitution mentioned earlier in our discussion of communications frameworks. And finally, we created a second bursary which compensated students for lost wages as a result of the strike. And this was largely aimed at students who rely on earning income from the campus employment, but whose hours reduced or canceled as a result of the strike. So this wasn't something that happened at every college, but this is an additional action that Sheridan took. And finally, we had to allocate staff time to processing refunds for those students who did withdraw.
Our recovery messages were crafted to reinforce our collective dedication to student success. So that for us meant focusing on all of Sheridan's services and faculty being committed to ensuring successful completion of the term, while also maintaining the quality and integrity of the program. Moreover, we knew that the level of frustration students felt could have a cascading effect on the relationships students have with faculty. So we tried to reinforce that the faculty members care about your well-being and they would be reasonable. Finally, we continue to reinforce a sense of gratitude, thanking students for their patience, and that as an institution, we're committed to ensuring that they would be successful.
So given how well our strike information microsite performed for us during the strike, we followed a really similar strategy for recovery. And we launched 2 new properties, all within a matter of days. Students were directed to a publicly facing site called Back to Class, which really replaced the strike info site. And then our academic colleagues were directed to an intranet site called Return to Work, where the first thing they could find was access to extended resources for their own mental health, their counseling, and their own well-being. We really wanted to make it clear that we understood that this strike was hard on them too, which signaled that we care about our faculty members and respect them. They also had quick access to tools for course design and delivery, as well as information on how to help students, because we know that students have a strong relationship with their faculty members and often turn to them for answers about what's happening at the college, rather than going to student affairs, for example. Our messaging at this stage focused on how glad we were to have people back and what we do to assist people. We also reassured students that they'd achieve their learning outcomes and would receive the education they were promised when they chose Sheridan, keeping in mind that our students receive the rights and protections of the Consumer Protection Act in Ontario. So at the outset, we mentioned that we'd be sharing some of the templates we created. Here are a number of the printed resource cards that we created to help frontline staff identify what students needed and how to help them or redirect them. We shared our communications on social and email just like during the strike and archived them back to the new microsite, the Back to Class site. We used a similar visual identity to grab people's attention, but used a different brand color, switching from blue to orange, to signal that these messages were about recovery. And on the first day students were back on campus, we had our beloved mascot Bruno wandering the halls with two signs, hug or high five, and all but one person took him up on his offer. We also had our president and provost hand-signed cards that were addressed to every returning faculty member, expressing how happy we were that the strike was over and that they were back. And as you can hopefully see, we used the same strategy of empathy, repetition, timeliness, and consistency that served us well during the strike. We left our hotlines up for about 1 month after the strike, but found that after 2 weeks, there was a dramatic drop-off of inquiries.
So lesson 9 is to find the diamonds in the rough. Of course, some good did come out of the strike, and we're always looking for the positive. With our focus on easing student anxiety, that's not collecting pre-scheduled payments, the 72-hour rule, our 24 calls for help that were spotted, and 14 accepting assistance. These are now part of our rule book for crisis management. In addition to the mental health escalations, we were also able to thwart a protest through our social media monitoring. We had noticed a large number of students organizing a rally on November 20th, which was the day after the strike ended, and when faculty were back, but not students. We went to the designated meeting spot on campus and took the provost with us. We welcomed all of the students into a large classroom and offered an impromptu open forum, which lasted almost 2 hours so that everyone could be heard. And it really helped to considerably diffuse the tension. Enabling classes to ramp up immediately post-strike, we also paid non-striking employees, non-striking part-time faculty during the strike, even though they weren't teaching. This kept them employed at Sheridan and available to be deployed. As the strike lasted 5 weeks, classes had to restart immediately if learning objectives were to be met in the time remaining for the term. So gaining support of returning faculty following the strike to have classes extended later into the evenings than customary, and to add Saturday classes to ensure learning outcomes could be met in the time remaining. We also successfully dispersed the ministry-mandated bursary for students who returned following the strike, despite the challenge of learning about the bursary on the same day it was promised to the public. As well, we established our own $100,000 fund, which was not mandated by the province, to compensate students for costs not covered by the ministry-mandated bursary. So today, we have new monitoring tools in place and more well-defined protocols for escalation procedures. And we've also codified what we felt our way through during the strike. Lesson 10 is to recognize your success. So going back to our campaign objectives, we can see that the outputs we created really hit the mark and served their purpose. We got our messages across and captured people's attention. People came to our anchor site and spent significant time there exposed to the content. And of course, even better than succeeding on outputs is succeeding on outcomes. So we're immensely proud that our net loss of students who dropped out and requested a refund was only 4.6% versus the 10% provincial average. We actually saved 856 students by deferring them to a new term. And comparing our year-over-year numbers, Sheridan also did not take a hit this past fall. In fact, our enrollment grew. Our first-year attrition rates were better than the year prior, and our enrollment grew by over 4% compared to 2017. We also had an increase in our second-year return student rate with about a 4% increase from 2017 to 18. So we're really proud that we succeeded on the desired outcome of maintaining a strong relationship with our academic colleagues. And unlike many of the other colleges who had upwards of 45 grievances, our academic staff only filed 3, and they were all wiped out or made redundant through the Arbiters Award, so none were actually heard locally. Despite everything, our student satisfaction rates for the quality of the learning environment remained positive and stayed within our normal limits of variation. And anecdotally, I know that our mass communication efforts had their desired effect when on week 1 of the strike, our Dean of Applied Science and Technology noted his utter bewilderment at the fact that he did not have a huge lineup winding outside of his office into the corridor of people gathering to demand answers, which was what he expected. He fully attributed this to our communication effort and getting information into people's hands in a timely manner. We're also incredibly proud to have had this campaign recognized with awards from the International Association of Business Communicators, CCAE, and the CPRF. And Christine won't acknowledge this, but it was just announced a couple months ago that she won 2 2018 Bulldog Stars of PR awards. She won the gold for Corporate Communications Professional of the Year and bronze for PR Professional of the Year.
So in a nutshell, here's a recap of our 10 lessons for surviving a prolonged work stoppage. This has now become our institutional blueprint for responding to a strike or another large-scale incident. And that takes us to the formal end of our presentation. At this point, we'd like to open up the floor to questions to see if there's anything you'd like us to ask, to expand on, or happy to answer your questions and chat further. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. This is Tara again. So everyone who is participating, I do encourage you to leave a question in the chat box, and Christine and Nicole will be able to field it. I do actually have a question for you ladies. Fingers crossed this isn't going to happen again, depending on how long that collective agreement was signed for. But what happens to this plan now? Does it get popped in a lockbox and then reviewed again, or is it something that's going to be revisited consistently to make sure that should something else occur, you're prepared?
Absolutely. It's a living plan, and we will continue to iterate on it and pull elements of it and the best practices from it, maybe not in its entirety, but depending on the context and the situation. And one of the things that I should mention is that some of the elements of this plan we actually pre-tested a year earlier when we had a smaller crisis, which was the delay of an expected opening of a building that would have doubled our capacity at one of our campuses. So our Mississauga campus at earlier, when it first opened, was only one building. And the year prior, the fall prior to the strike, we had expected to open a second sister building that would double our capacity. And throughout the summer, we found that it really looked like the contractors were not going to have the building ready on time. So we needed to jump into action. And with that as well, we used a lot of two-way communication. We used a lot of very open and transparent communication. And we also were committed to restitution. And independently, our institution offered a $500 bursary to any student who was going to be affected, because what was decided is that for 1 month or for one term, they would have to keep at a different campus, or they would be assigned to a different campus. And then when the building was open in the following January, they would be moved to their proper home campus. So that idea of this bursary is how we also got the idea to use a bursary similarly with the strike. So it's just one example of, just because you've used it once, you've tested, and then you keep building on this. And we also have, for other issues, had open forums that tended to work well. With the strike, we live streamed them, which was something new. We had live the teleprompters and the transcription and the caption, which was new. So we always are trying to build on what works well in one area and then try to reiterate and improve for the future.
And this past fall, a number of members of our executive team attended some FEMA training out of the some best practices for 3 days?
Yeah.
And so how FEMA looks at crisis response for large organizations. And it was really, I think, a big takeaway for everyone was that it fails at the policy level. So making sure that you think through all of your processes well in advance of any crisis.
Perfect. There are 2 questions in the queue. One of them is, was this the first strike that Sheridan has experienced? And how big is that comms team?
So in fact, it was not the first strike. About 5 or 6 years prior, there was a support staff strike. So that was a little different in that classes are able to run in a support staff strike. That was all of our frontline employees. Things were tricky and difficult. A lot of changes needed to be made, a lot of communications needed to be made, but the students probably didn't feel the impact of that one as strongly because they were still able to attend class. And the templates that I mentioned, where 5 months out in advance of the strike, every unit had to fill out what would stop, start, and continue. We had used that similar exercise in the support staff strike many, many years ago. And then we also averted a strike about 3 years ago. I believe, again, it was with support staff, but we did all that prep work in the lead up and then didn't need to use it. So we, again, tried to keep using those. In terms of the size of the communications staff, at the time of the strike, we had a director of communications, we had a manager of media relations, a manager of digital marketing and social media, and then we had
a part-time employee and 2 co-op students.
And then we also had a full-time support staff internal communications person and a full-time digital media communications person. And everybody just dropped what they were doing for 5 or 6 weeks, and it was all hands on deck with the team supporting.
Perfect. So a question that came in is, how did you leverage others to assist? And who did you ask for help in getting the messaging out?
So we leveraged others in that, if we think back to the honeycomb slide with the 3 meetings per day, our senior leadership, of course, was very invested in making sure this issue was managed properly. So they were at the table. We had the 3 meetings every day, which were update meetings where HR would provide an update, communications would provide an update about what we're hearing on the social channels and on our hotlines. Our student affairs team would provide our update, the dean of student affairs, who would talk about the in-person visits she had. The director of the library was talking about the chatter she was hearing in the library and so forth. So we kept the communication flowing there. There wasn't a lot we had to do to ask for help because everybody was invested and really part of the planning process from 5 months prior to the strike. In terms of how did we ask others for help, we created templates that the people who held relationships with for the secondary stakeholders could then execute upon. So for example, our Faculty of Applied Health and Community Studies, which has programs like early childhood education and social service worker, paralegal programs and so forth, many of those programs have mandatory field placements. There was about 1,400 students whose field placements needed to be put on hold during the strike. And that dean and those program coordinators are the ones who liaise with industry to find those field placements. So we would create template letters that talked about what's happening, how long we expect the strike to last, what we know, what we don't know, where the resources are, handed them over to the deans and the program coordinators, who then customized them further as appropriate. And they handled the communication more with the secondary audiences. So you'll recall we had our primary audience stakeholders and our secondary. We really communicated with the primary stakeholders, but engaged other leaders such as deans and program coordinators to do that direct communication with the secondary audiences because they already held those relationships.
And we really tried to use the website as the core spot for all information. And because the strike was so fluid, we ended up updating the web pages over 250 times, I think close to 300 times in the 5-week period. So we always tried to redirect everybody back to that as our source of truth with the most up-to-date information. And we also had to divide and conquer. So we had the contact center triaging all of the inbound phone calls to the hotline. We had certain people who were just allocated to doing the email responses, and then certain members of the social team were just focused on social listening and then responding to those questions accordingly.
Yeah, our student affairs team also has skilled staff members who do reach out calls proactively around orientation and other times of the year. So we wrote a script for them, and they started with the priority stakeholder group of first-year students in the first term. So students who aren't really sure what to expect with college life and their college experience, probably had a lot of fear and worry, also didn't have a lot of established networks and channels to go to for support. So we started with them, and that was about 7,000 students who received a proactive phone call out using the script from those staff members who are trained and normally used to calling students and having conversations on the phone.
Perfect. So I think we have time for one last question. How did you convince people to let you live stream the forum? Were you worried about the risk of doing that?
So I think thankfully, we are blessed with an executive who is committed to quality, character, and accountability, and we really try to live up to those core themes. So it honestly didn't take a lot of convincing. In prior years, we've had different issues, and again, we've iterated as we've gone where we haven't live streamed. But I think partly there was a comfort level from doing these forums, knowing that we've done similar forums in the past. I think it was the urgency and the sentiment. If you recall, Nicole mentioned those forums happened at around week 3 when tensions really started to escalate and the mood started to shift. So using that information and sharing the voices of our audiences and helping people understand how worried people were, our executive leadership team really understood the need to do this and to help as many people as we could. We wanted to make it totally accessible so that we recognized that students weren't on campus every day. Some of them, as Nicole mentioned, went home, those especially who lived in residence and who thought, you know, maybe this is going to be prolonged. We didn't want them to miss the information, and we recognized they wouldn't necessarily be able to come to campus. So in that respect, it was a bit of an easier sell to say, this is why we absolutely need to live stream.
Perfect. So that's coming up to the top of the hour. So I think, and it looks like we're good on questions. So folks, if you do have anything that might come up after the session, the information, the contact details for the presenters was included, as well. This deck and the recording will be made available following the session. So glad to see things are going well at Sheridan and some positive results from a not so positive time. I would like to thank you both very much for sharing some insight and some valuable learnings that you went through. Those messages and being transparent with, I think, your advancement colleagues will really lend itself to some learnings should anybody find themselves in a similar situation. So again, I would like to thank Ranbir Kang, who was on at the beginning of this call, our presenters, Nicole and Christine, everybody for being with us today. And I wish you, wherever you are, a very lovely end to your day. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.